Today, we're going to talk about the Necromancer, the master of undeath. With their undead army, bone magic, blood magic, and reaping or darkness magic, this class is an absolute beast. Necromancers have a unique skill at the start of the game, Raise Skeleton. Whenever you kill an enemy, you're able to turn that into a skeletal warrior that can then assist you in combat. You can have up to 4 of these at the start of the game, and they really trivialize the starting out of this game. Your basic resource is Essence. Both your basic attacks as well as just over time, Essence refills. So you're always going to start fights with a full bar and you're going to regenerate it regularly throughout the fight. The first basic attack we're going to talk about is Reap. You let out a giant scythe that slashes out enemies, generating 4 Essence per enemy hit, and dealing a very small amount of damage. 3 damage is pretty low. But it does increase your tankiness quite a bit. This ability can really ramp up if you begin killing targets with it. As you kill targets with Reap and Enhanced Reap, you begin to get mega attack speed increases. 30% is massive. Sever is the skill that we paired with this. This sends out a little clone version of yourself that goes out, slashes, comes back to you, and slashes again. This does a lot of damage, and it's very subtle. It's kind of hard to tell that it's happening. Let's watch here. So we send out a Reap, and then we send out a Sever, and a little skeleton comes out and does a rotation, comes back, and does a second rotation. Watching it again here, it goes out, slash, comes back, slashes again. It's very subtle and hard to tell with all of the skeletons. Enhanced Sever makes it so that the enemies in the path of Sever take a little bit of the damage of the initial attack. So when it goes out, it does some damage to everybody in between, and same when it returns. If you like Vulnerable, get Paranormal Sever to make sure you can stack up that debuff on enemies. Supernatural Sever gives you a small increase in the damage of the skill based off how many minions you have. Early game you can only have 4, but that can ramp up. It was a little bit hard to tell how effective this class's skills were at cleaning up enemies just because of how powerful the little skeletal army was. But Reap definitely felt like it was good at taking out small groups of enemies, and it did pretty decent damage against the elites, especially casting those Severs. Sever could go out and deal massive damage to elite targets. Just watch their health melt away. Boss fights get a little bit silly with the Necromancer. The bosses get so confused by the little army of skeletons that it was really easy. Reap was easy to keep a distance from the enemy, do decent damage, send out those Severs. We just had a really easy time with this boss. In harder difficulty modes, the Necromancer is not going to be as good as it is in the basic one. In the easy mode, the skeletons just take up so much of the threat on enemies that you're just going to have a really pleasant time fighting bosses and packs of enemies alike. Decompose is the other starting darkness skill and allows you to channel into enemies, dealing some massive damage to them, and also summoning piles of blood that you can turn into your skeletal corpses. So these piles of blood can become your little skeletal army, and this Decompose skill allows you to get those even on single target encounters. Enhanced Decompose makes sure if you kill a target with Decompose, you get a huge essence burst. This allows you to just spam your secondary skill, which is Blight, an explosion of damage, leaving a pool of darkness that deals AoE damage to enemies within them. This is really good for handling the groups of enemies. They would just stand in that free AoE damage on them and melt away. Enhanced Blight just added a slowing effect to the Blight pool, so slowing them down and making them take even more damage from that effect. You can enhance this to immobilize enemies initially hit with Paranormal Blight, or you can make it so that your minions deal increased damage if they're within the Blight zone with Supernatural Blight. This one was really powerful. The combination of how much damage your minions deal, plus how much damage Blight deals, really made it so that you could take on enemies without effort with this skill. You also left so many blood pools, you could keep up your army really easily. The threat of elite enemies was practically non-existent, as you had your little army, plus you're able to drop a Blight and then decompose them down to nothingness. This specialization definitely felt super safe. The boss is a little bit more dangerous. Channeling into them with Decompose puts you in a very vulnerable spot, and the boss will just chase you down and deal some massive damage to you. But dropping a Blight on them while they're standing doing a long animation just dealt so much damage, and having your minions be able to just stand there and wail on the boss just meant that you were not really in a risk of losing this fight at all. The specialization definitely felt awesome as a Necromancer. You felt like the class, you felt exactly like everything you were doing was what you wanted to do. It was a really top-notch specialization. Moving on to Bone Magic, Bone Splinters fires off 3 splinters, dealing a small amount of damage. Each subsequent time a target is hit by those same Bone Splinters, you gain extra essence. So spamming this ability was just an essence booster, but it didn't gain nearly as much essence as things like Decompose. Enhancing this made it shoot out 5 instead of 3 splinters. This boosts the damage by like 30%, which is pretty decent. Bone Spear shoots out a piercing blast that deals huge damage to all targets it goes through. This is awesome for shooting out when you go through a doorway into a new pack of enemies. Enhanced Bone Spear makes it break into shards for a little bit of extra damage when it hits a wall behind its target. So you shoot it through a target, it hits the back wall, and comes back dealing extra damage. Paranormal Bone Spear can make that up to 5 targets if it critically strikes, and boosts its critical strike chance. Where Supernatural Bone Spear makes the first enemy hit vulnerable, which is a huge buff for massive damage on that target. This is kind of the AoE versus single target options. I definitely felt Bone was kind of lackluster. The Bone Spear was quite burstly powerful, but the actual Bone Shards, the Bone Splinters, were just not very strong, and I didn't love the specialization. Compared to the other Necromancer-y ones, this one didn't feel as Necromancer-y, and I didn't really like the lore feel behind it, or the thematic feel behind it. It also really struggled to take out priority targets. The triple Bone Spear just didn't deal enough damage to single targets. You really needed that piercing attack, so if you didn't have the essence, you couldn't really take out those targets. Despite feeling like a range specialization, on the boss you really got the feeling that you had to get up close and personal to hit them with multiple of those spears to really get the chunking damage, but it just didn't feel that great. Also, the piercing damage of the major Bone Spear attack just didn't really have that great of an effect on bosses like this. It just didn't deal enough damage. I rarely felt like this was the most lackluster and weakest of the Necromancer specializations, and I didn't have a great time playing the Bone specialization. Blood Magic is a pretty decent attack. You do a little burst of damage onto the target, dealing small amounts of damage and a chance to form a Blood Orb. Picking that up heals you for 15% of your maximum life, which really had just awesome sustain. Enhanced Hemorrhage makes it so that after you pick up a Blood Orb, your next Hemorrhage also deals damage to enemies around your target. This gave you nice bursts of AoE damage. After clearing up one pack, you can go right into the next pack for extra damage. Blood Surge really wanted you to get into the middle of groups of enemies. You would do an explosion around you based off how much blood you soaked from nearby enemies. This is a very powerful skill and just burst down groups of enemies really enjoyably and reliably. Enhanced Blood Surge just increased the self-healing potential of this specialization. Massive amounts of personal healing as you deal AoE damage to multiple targets was just huge. You felt super safe. Paranormal Blood Surge made it so that if you hit enemies while you were healthy is above 80% health, you gained overwhelming blood, and at 5 stacks you gained massive overpower. This is huge damage based off of the sum of your life. Supernatural Blood Surge gave you a lot of Fortified. Now, it was really hard to get up to this 50% of your maximum life Fortified on this, so I didn't really get a lot of advantage of the 20% increased damage. I definitely think Paranormal Blood Surge was a better early option. For Blood, there was also Blood Lance. This gave a stacking lance onto the target that dealt damage to the target that you lanced, plus all other enemies that were also lanced. This is a really cool additional skill. Enhancing that with Enhanced Blood Lance made it so that this thing now pierced through enemies that were lanced. Spamming that lance was very rewarding. Supernatural Blood Lance makes it so that if you cast it 8 times, your next one is a guaranteed overpower for massive damage. And Paranormal Blood Lance made it so that as long as a boss or 2 enemies are Blood Lanced, you gain massive attack speed increases. We really liked Paranormal Blood Lance. So Blood Lance, as a skill, was a really awesome boss killer. I think Blood's specialization was a pretty decent boss fighter. The AoE Blood Explosion was not great on the boss, but if you got up and you did the Blood Lancing, you could stack up those lances for huge amounts of damage. My biggest problem with the Blood Lance specialization of Blood was that you didn't really get a feel of Necromancer-iness. The blood attacks were very subtle and you couldn't really see them happening, and it just didn't feel as rewarding as some of the other specializations like Reap or the Decompose specialization. As you can see here, it's really hard to tell if the effects are going off. There's just a little bit of red effect. It just wasn't feeling great. It also felt like it took a lot longer to take down the boss of this specialization than any of the other ones. Necromancer is probably my favorite class that I've played so far in Diablo IV. I had a lot of fun with all of its skills and abilities, and the skeletal army is really my jam. I'm a huge Necromancer player in all games, and I hope you'll give this class a shot in Diablo IV. Up next, we're going to talk about the Sorcerer. If death and decomposition is not your thing, maybe fire, frost, and lightning is.